All right. Well, let's go back to the early '60s and this notion of there was this idea in the within the Democratic Party, or within, and not just within the Democratic Party, I guess also without the through on the outside of the Democratic Party, that there was a cleave in the Democratic Party that could be exploited. Just set this up for us.
Yeah, so, the Democratic Party in the 1960s was kind of this strange animal that had, on the one hand, like the most progressive politicians in the country in it, like people like Hubert Humphrey, who came up for civil rights in '48, people like, all kinds of like liberals from the North who were closely allied with labor unions and were progressive. And then on the other hand, it had the Dixiecrats in it, who were the most reactionary political forces in the country, right? Who were totally opposed to civil rights, who hated labor unions, and who worked to block basically any progressive legislation from being passed. And so the party existed as this kind of strange hybrid containing these two totally opposite political poles within it. And for a lot of people on the left, they looked at that and said, okay, this is a situation that can't last. This is unstable. There's a real contradiction here. How can we exploit that into kind of developing into something that's much more favorable to us? And the idea was, this idea had kind of been around since the 30s, but once the civil rights movement kicked off, it acquired new force as kind of that really pushed the Dixiecrat contradiction to the fore. But the idea was, if we can get the Dixiecrats out of the party, what we'll have is a party run by the liberals, and we'll have a party that's basically something like, European social democracy. That's really based on alliance with the unions and is going to be a force for progressive legislation in the country. And you can, again, I think it's really easy to see the appeal of that, and it reflected some sharp strategic thinking that really, had a very, very concrete assessment of the balance of forces in the country.
Give us a sense of how the Democratic Party found itself, let's say by 1960. I mean, it happened earlier, but within it, two such a polar opposite. I don't know if they are. Are they polar opposite groups? I mean, to a certain extent, sounds like it. How is it possible that the Democrats had those two polar opposites wound up with those two different those two different poles in the party? I mean, this isn't just like, everybody under the umbrella. These are people on basically two different sides of the umbrella.
Totally. Yeah. So in order to understand this, you have to understand that since the turn of the 20th century, in which, the Republican Party really emerged as like a consolidated party of business. And until the 1930s was basically the default party of government, with the Democrats were basically a minority party who could win sometimes. But the Democrats and the reason they were a minority party was because they were essentially a regional party that was based in the South. After the consolidation of Jim Crow in the 1890s, Republicans basically didn't exist in the South, and so the South was a Democratic stronghold that then also worked in alliance with the kind of political machines in various cities in the North. So it was, a regional party with kind of basically satellite offices in cities across the country, and whereas the Republicans were the nationwide party of business. And so, at that point, the Democratic Party was quite weak. In the 1930s, things changed as the insurgency of the labor movement, basically starting in 1934 when there's general strikes in 3 American cities, and then continuing through the sit-down strikes in the auto industry, and, an absolutely massive wave of working-class struggle, shakes up American politics in a fundamental way. And a section of the business class that had been, tightly allied with the Republican Party before begins to look for new options. And there's two groups in this class that are important. One are banks that are internationally oriented, that are oriented towards international trade, and banks, like commercial banks. And they're very upset with the Republicans because the Republicans had been a protectionist party, right? They were the party of American business. American business wanted protection from foreign competition. And so if you were the business party, you supported the tariff. And these kind of free trading banks really didn't like that, particularly, like the Smoot-Hawley tariff that comes in the early 30s. The other group were industries that were capital intensive and very advanced. So like the oil industry, for example, right? In the oil industry, you have to invest a lot more in machinery than in labor compared to something like agriculture, right, which is very labor intensive. What that means is that if labor costs rise, it hurts an industry like agriculture more than an industry like oil. And so these kind of capital-intensive countries were looking at the situation of economic collapse and working class insurgency and saying, okay, this is not working. We can actually live with some reforms like unions, like minimum wage laws, like some things that'll tighten up labor markets. We can live with that. If wages go up and we have to pay a little bit higher wages, that's not going to kill us. And so they looked to the Democratic Party under Franklin Roosevelt as the way to accomplish this. Now, the other side of this is in the South, which is also suffering from the Depression, Southern politicians were very interested in aid from the government and subsidies and government public works projects, all of this kind of thing, because the South was so economically backward. It was quite destitute during the 1930s. And so while they weren't interested in unions or any of that kind of thing, or were quite opposed to them because of the dominance of agriculture in the South, they were interested in deficit spending and public works and those parts of the New Deal. And so these two groups kind of found a way to live with each other around this kind of expanded government, deficit spending, public works, all of that kind of stuff. There were conflicts over labor and civil rights, but they were, until really the civil rights movement kicks off in the 50s, those conflicts were subordinate to the basic agreement that they found.
So basically, the Democratic Party became a home to be able to deliver the goods for three different constituencies when those goods did not in any way or did not fundamentally contradict each other.
Right. Yep. So yeah, like labor, the South, and an advanced section of business.
And so that carries through until this, basically this idea that civil rights have become more urgent, and then the left perceives an opportunity to hack off one of those constituencies, I guess, in the party, so that they could become the dominant force.
Yeah, and I would say that like a crucial understanding how things turned out, or why things turned out how they did, is that the left in this period didn't really see the centrality of the business constituency in the Democratic Party. They only saw labor in the South. And so they said, if we get rid of the South, labor is going to rule the roost. And that was that's why the strategy failed, even as it succeeded in getting the South out of the Democrats.
All right, let's dig into that. I mean, because you talk about a couple of people who were very important in this attempt, and we called it a realignment. I mean, this was I guess the next realignment. I guess the one prior to that would have been during the New Deal, or just leading up to the New Deal. And then this is the next one that we're going to have in 1965. And then I would say probably the next one is probably what they would say was Reagan realigning in a different way. But talk about some of these figures. You mentioned Rustin first, I believe. Just talk about these figures and why there was such this blind spot to the presence of this one sector of industry or capital.
Yeah, so I mean, Bayard Rustin was, probably the most important person in pushing the realignment strategy, and is one of the most fascinating figures in the history of the American left. I mean, he was a communist in the 1930s. He was a pacifist and an organizer of A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington in the 40s. In the 50s, he was doing anti-imperialist work, and very quickly became one of Martin Luther King's most trusted advisors. Really, I mean, one of the most talented and dynamic organizers the American left has ever produced. And in his spare time, he ran a catering business and sang and performed at people's parties and things. I mean, he was just like, you read about him and you're like, what couldn't this guy do? But he pushed the strategy of realignment within the civil rights movement as one of the kind of leading figures within the civil rights movement, arguing that, like, okay, we're protesting in Montgomery, we're protesting in Birmingham, but there's something bigger that all of this can be linked to, that this can actually completely transform American politics by smashing the power of the Dixiecrats and realigning the Democratic Party. And he was joined in this by, kind of a whole crew of very talented organizers, people like Michael Harrington, who founded the Democratic Socialists of America, who was in a small Trotskyist group in the 1950s, led by a guy named Max Shachtman, who was kind of like the lead strategist for all of this. Like a lot of these planning meetings would happen at Shachtman's house out in Queens. So like there was a whole kind of cadre of people who had been through the 50s together, and sometimes even, going back even longer than that, and who kind of all cohered around this vision that there could be an American Labor Party, there could be an American Social Democratic Party if the Dixiecrats were kicked out of the Democratic Party. And
now, why? Let me ask you this: was there? But these are all, members of at least different organizations that theoretically. What was there a simultaneous argument about we need to start a third party, or was it? Were there these type of ideas going on parallel, or was it simply like we've got to go where the opportunity is, and this is the best opportunity?
Well, so in the 1940s, Shachtman and kind of his group had been oriented on convincing like Walter Reuther and kind of the progressive sections of the labor officialdom to start a third party, to start a labor party. And that had been their orientation. But, as we get into the 50s, and as the contradiction between the Dixiecrats and the rest of the party is really highlighted by civil rights struggle, when there's people in the streets, when there's, when people are getting sprayed with fire hoses, that's on TV, and you have these Dixiecrats getting up and defending it, and then you have like these northern politicians who are for civil rights, condemning that. It highlights that contradiction in a way that makes it just impossible to ignore. And so as that happened, they kind of shifted away from the third party perspective and said, essentially their perspective became we can build the third party from within the Democratic Party, more or less.
The subtraction will be basically addition on some level.
Yeah, exactly. And I, in general, like third-party efforts on the American left had really kind of withered since the Wallace campaign in '48, when Wallace was really hammered by Truman, and so since then the third-party strategy had really lost its allure.
Hello, you. I'm Sam Seder. Looking for smart progressive talk that is occasionally amusing? Well, subscribe to our YouTube feed. Subscribe to our podcast, like us on Facebook, and just generally enjoy us.